All right. Thanks, Tom. Josh Osborn from the Forbes Biological Station, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our cover mapping data here. I'll talk quickly and briefly, hopefully, about the pre-drawdown or the pre-initial drawdown response. I'd like to concentrate on the 2016 to 2019 response. Unfortunately, we do not have the cover map from last year because we were waiting on the aerial imagery, which we actually just got. So you have to tune in next time for that cover map. Historically, the Illinois River Valley provided extensive and valuable habitat to migratory water birds and other wetland-dependent wildlife in the valley. Backwater lakes and tributaries were rich in aquatic vegetation and looked an awful lot like this, which is Rice Lake, a state-owned, state-managed property north of Emiquon in 1950. Vegetation communities included lotus patches, pickerelweed, pondweed, annual and perennial grasses and sedges, and water celery in some places. And you know what's coming next, the changing landscape. Due to extensive leveeing and drainage, this is that same lake, Rice Lake, in about 2005, I believe. So we eliminated about half, probably a little over half of the natural wetlands in the Illinois Valley and destroyed or significantly degraded what actually remains. And sedimentation, exotic species, and eutrophication kind of rule the day. But despite those losses and degradation, the IRV still remains an important resource for migratory birds in the valley. And you saw that with some of Stephanie's work with the nesting marsh birds, and you'll see that a little bit later on with the science snapshot that Aaron does on the water bird and waterfowl response. Fortunately, we have this beautiful restored floodplain wetland thanks to the Nature Conservancy, and I won't get into the history of restoration and all that. I feel like that's been well covered this morning, but it is one of the most substantial efforts in the Upper Miss and Great Lakes region to date. Nature Conservancy established through discussions with researchers key ecological attributes to kind of monitor and evaluate successes of the restoration. And for this particular project, this particular portion of the restoration, we'll talk about water bird habitat quality. We're going to talk about vegetation community, and those are measured by moist soil plant production, seed production. And we'll talk about a little bit about cattail and hemi-marsh components of that wetland, and we'll talk about woody encroachment and invasives. So at the end of each growing season, usually around September, October, we map all wetland vegetation communities, mud flats, and areas containing any surface water on the property. We delineate these vegetation communities using this handheld Archer unit that you see in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. That turns into a bunch of these dots. And so we follow the edge of, say, persistent emergent cover type to moist soil cover type, and we try to map that edge going along at each waypoint, collecting species composition and other metrics. These dots eventually turn into polygons that look a lot like this. We overlaid these dots onto aerial imagery to get to these polygons, and ultimately classify these polygons into our vegetation community classes, such as aquatic bed, which is the green crosshatched white blobs that you see there, moist soil vegetation communities, which is the yellow crosshatch areas here, open water, which is the light blue, floating leaf aquatic veg, which is the dark blue, and usually there's some mud flats and some persistent emergent vegetation in there as well. We track the response of invasive plants by calculating the proportion of those polygons that I just talked about that actually contain invasive species annually. And so this just gives us a good way to track whether or not invasives are spreading, and helps the Nature Conservancy get an idea on what needs to be controlled and what's actually not becoming a problem, at least not yet. During that same time frame, we collect moist soil seed cores to evaluate food production on the landscape for waterfowl and other water birds. And so this takes this shape or takes the form of 30 moist soil seed cores that we take back to the lab, wash through a series of graduated sieves, and ultimately dry and pick these seed components. And what we're looking at with these are seed densities, which takes the shape of kilograms per hectare, and ultimately duck energy days, which is the amount of energy available to ducks and how large of a population that the landscape can actually support in any given winter. So before we get into the weeds here with some of the results, it's important to keep in mind the marsh cycle and exactly where we are in the marsh cycle. We started out with this dry marsh phase. It's kind of a choked out or dense vegetation where there's not a lot of open water. Through rainfall or bringing on water, as it were, you eventually get to this regenerating marsh phase, which is kind of a more aquatic bed, open water with diverse emergent, whether it's non-persistent emergent with cattails persistent emergent with cattails or non-persistent with moist soil vegetation. And through time, especially with high water like we saw on Emiquon, and insects and plant senescence and even diseases in some cases, you start to turn into this degenerating marsh and then a lake marsh, which is more often described as kind of the bathtub effect, where you don't really have anything in the middle. You just have a little bit of vegetation around the outside. And that drought or drawdown is set to hopefully reset that cycle and kind of provide get back to a more diverse landscape for the critters that use it. So I'll go through this quick, but you can see this is what our cover maps actually look like. In 2007, we were very much in that dry marsh phase where there wasn't a ton of water on the landscape, about 250 hectares, and ultimately getting to the year prior to drawdown, 2015, which we were very much in a dead marsh or lake marsh type of scenario. In 2018 to 2019, 2018 I chose to use here because it was really the first, even though we started the initial drawdown in 2016, it was really the first real drawdown year where conditions were right, water was low enough that we got some solid moist soil vegetation growth. And you see that with the yellow cross-hatched area here. Not a lot of aquatic bed except on Flag Lake here. Thompson Lake still mostly open water, but a ton of moist soil production. A lot of food out there for the migrating birds in the fall and the next spring. 2019, if you followed that hydrology graph that Doug showed earlier this morning, you'll know that 2019 we got a little bit of an influx in water, and so and I'll talk about it a little bit earlier, but the moist soil vegetation community and the aquatic bed kind of flip-flopped. There wasn't really a lot of moist soil out there, but gee, there was sure a lot of aquatic bed, such as coontail, some of the pondweed species, and lots of other things in there also. So I'll go through these graphs. This is just kind of a graphical representation of what we saw on the landscape. From 2007 to 2015, the aquatic bed, there was a subtle decline and a subtle increase in the open water, which is indicative of that marsh, that kind of degenerating or dead marsh phase, at least on this end, on the later end of that. And in the years post drawdown, aquatic bed return, and you can kind of see it dropped off drastically in that dry year in 2018, but it responded really quickly in 2019. And in in the open water category over here, you see that the open water stayed consistent throughout. I should probably have described this graph a little better before I got started, but this is this axis here is the percent coverage of this particular community. And the bottom obviously is the year. Hemi-marsh, again, this is prior to drawdown. Hemi-marsh kind of slowly dropped, and these last couple of years here, it was not so much as hemi-marsh as just dead or dying cattail. And so we didn't really know what to classify these areas as. They certainly weren't persistent emergent vegetation because there was enough of the cattail dying back, but there was enough of it, and it kind of still served the function of a hemi-marsh. Hemi-marsh and persistent emergent vegetation, which is largely made up of cattail and burreed and those types of things, haven't really recovered quite as quickly as the aquatic bed does, and you can see that here. So that first year, 2016, there was still somewhat of a I guess a dead cattail hemi-marsh, and it kind of I feel like in 2017, 2018 is really when you started to regenerate some cattail, but it just hasn't quite, the cattail or the persistent emergent vegetation coverage hasn't quite recovered as quickly as the aquatic bed did. We just haven't really reached that peak of that on the landscape as quickly as we did with the aquatic bed. Obviously, moist soil vegetation declined as we got more and more water on. And then once we got water control in 2016, and we're able to draw down and see that response in 2018, obviously the influx of water in 2019 kind of covered that up, kind of became aquatic bed. And I think in 2020, what we're going to see is just kind of anecdotally from being out there and mapping, we're going to see that same flip-flop. It's going to look a lot more, this non-persistent emergent vegetation is going to look a lot more like 2018, and the aquatic bed will look a lot more like 2018 also. Seed density, so prior to drawdown years, seed density was about, I want to say the average was 690 kilograms per hectare. We've more than doubled that since drawdown. So in the years since 2016, we're about 1,450 kilograms per hectare. Duck energy days, which is, again, the amount of energy that, the amount of ducks that we can sustain over time based on the food that we have on the landscape. Prior to drawdown, we only met the good, or I guess we only met the KEA goals 1 year, and that was in 2010. And it looks like based on the last, I guess based on these years, 18 and 19 and 2020 is certainly going to be high also. So it looks like we're in a good spot. Invasive plants, we did knock back reed canary grass initially, although there is a slight upward trend in the past couple of years. Phragmites control seems to be working, so no real response due to drawdown, but a lot of that is likely because Nature Conservancy staff just keeps it controlled so well. Eurasian water milfoil is a large component of our aquatic bed out there, unfortunately, but it seems to be relatively constant, and it stays mostly on average about 40 to 45% coverage, and that's typically seen in the aquatic bed community and the hemi-marsh community. Curly pondweed and Lithrum here, purple loosestrife, are kind of inconsistent. We haven't really seen much of them, to be quite honest. So spotting those is not common, and that's a good thing. Excuse me, I had to take a drink of water. So let's get into this discussion. Initial drawdown was recommended to reverse the trends that you saw earlier, to reverse the trends of that degenerating or lake marsh stays, and that's certainly accomplished. In 2019, aquatic bed and moist soil kind of flip-flopped a little bit, something that was noted immediately post-drawdown, and you could probably classify 2019 as that regenerating marsh phase. When water was drawn down again in this 2020 year, so last year, aquatic bed vegetation, or that submerged aquatic vegetation, and moist soil vegetation like the annual and perennial grasses and sedges seem to flip-flop again. Based on observations from initial restoration and the drawdown in 2016, aquatic bed seems to restore pretty quickly. Unfortunately, the cattail and burr reed component, while they have started to gradually come back, they just don't seem to respond quite as quickly, and we haven't hit that peak. I think peak numbers in the few years post drawdown was something like 15 to 16%, and we're just not seeing that. Previous studies have observed a decline in water bird production in wetlands that lose a significant amount of this persistent emergent cover. And that's certainly something that we saw in our brood surveys that we do, and previous marsh bird nest searches during those lean years that we had. Stephanie touched on some of the predator components and how losing this cattail component can affect marsh bird nests on a loss scale. So not just not having them, but the ones that you actually have, you're losing to predators. Preliminary observations indicate that a soil moisture component and organic matter are low and density is high, suggesting that soil properties don't necessarily affect aquatic plant growth. And so this is something that I didn't really talk about how we do it in consideration of time, but we took from the time post drawdown to now, we took 15 soil core samples, and we looked at soil consolidation, organic matter, and bulk density, because we wanted to see if, as we drew down, if the soil's consolidated such that it might impact aquatic vegetation growth, and that's not something that we're really seeing. Moist soil seed response was phenomenal. In the years post drawdown, average seed density was double that we observed in the pre-drawdown years, and obviously that's great for a lot of migrating birds, but it's also just great for the seed bank itself. Unfortunately, we weren't in 2020 when that aquatic bed and the moist soil component flip-flopped again. Unfortunately, we had all this seed on the ground, but we weren't able to get water on it as quickly as possible. So a lot of that was unrealized food production. And Aaron will be presenting a little bit later in his science snapshot on what the waterfowl response looked like last fall, and maybe that'll paint a better picture of what the response was in lieu of having food on the ground, but not necessarily having water on the food. Reed canary grass was stunted during drawdown. I talked about that a little bit, but responded relatively quickly. I'm actually excited to look at the 2020 cover map to see if that same trend holds. The Phragmites control seems to be working. I'm more than happy every time that I'm out there on an ATV or in the airboat or in the gator tail when I see a large stand of frag that's just completely nuked. So, and I think in 2020, so last year, looking out, I can count more of those than I can remember seeing actual viable Phragmites plants, and that's a good thing. The 2020 cover map that's coming will certainly include more woody encroachment. There's a lot of willow and a lot of cottonwood that's out there now, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It might provide a little bit more diverse of a landscape out there and even ameliorate some of the levee damage that's occurring due to wind throw. But again, with most things, probably needs to be carefully monitored and not let get out of hand like happened in the neighboring federal property, the Chautauqua National Wildlife Refuge.
About a minute, Josh.
That's all I have. If anyone has any questions, I'm glad to answer them in the time that we have left, or I'm glad to chat about it since I did not leave much time.